Welcome to this video series on the Making International in Korea. We'll begin in this week of videos with a description and explanation of the core principles and practices of international law and discuss the primary sources of international law in Korea, such as Korea-United States relationship from the perspective of international law. First, let me touch upon the UN resolutions concerning independence of Korea and the Korean War. The relationship between Korea and the United Nations dates back to the December 1945, when future of the war was addressed by the United States, Soviet Union, and the UK at the Moscow Conference of Foreign Ministers. At the end of the World War II, Korea, which was under the Japanese colonial rule from 1910 to 1945, was occupied by the United States and Soviet Union. At the Moscow Conference, a joint commission was to be drawn, both from the United States and the Soviet Union, commands in their respective zones to assist in forming a provisional Korean government. As there was little progress toward formation of a provisional Korean government, the problem of Korean independence was brought to the United Nations in September 1947. Although it was challenged that the question of Korea as an agenda from World War II was only to be discussed by the parties to the Moscow Agreement, the UN General Assembly eventually passed a resolution 112 on November 14, 1947, establishing a United Nations Temporary Commission on Korea. The mandate of this commission was to facilitate and expedite the attainment of the national independence of Korea and the withdrawal of the occupying forces. The Korean War from 1950 to 1953 was the United Nations one of the earliest challenges. Since its inception in 1945, as the Korean War fit into a part of the whole Cold War scenario. In fact, it was the first occasion on which members of the United Nations acted collectively to repel aggression. As the war broke out on June 25, 1950, the UN Security Council immediately adopted a resolution by 9 votes to none, with 1 abstention of Yugoslavia, which determined that the armed attack by North Korea that constitutes a breach and called upon the all member states to render every assistance to the United Nations in the execution of a resolution and to refrain from giving assistance to the North Korean authorities. The Security Council further recommended, through its resolution, that the members of the United Nations furnishes such assistance to the Republic of Korea as may be necessary to repel armed attack and to restore international peace and security in the area. The Security Council resolution welcoming the prompt response by the United Nations based on the previous resolutions of the 82 and 83 established a unified command led by the United States to coordinate the war. On July 31, 1950, the Security Council held that North Korea's invasion constitutes an unlawful attack and coordinated relief for victims of Korean War through its Resolution 85. On January 31, 1991, the I-10 complaint of aggression upon the Republic of Korea was unanimously removed from the agenda of the Security Council. The United Nations received much support for taking robust action against North Korea, while a veto vote by the Soviet Union was frequently used to block numerous Security Council initiatives during the Korean War. As a result, a resolution called Uniting for Peace was adopted by the UN General Assembly resolution, which states that If the Security Council fails to exercise its primary responsibility to act as required to maintain international peace and security due to lack of unanimity of permanent members, the General Assembly should take over to keep the impetus for peace. Let me touch upon the legal ground of the United States military forces stationed in Korea. The United States military forces occupied the southern half of Korea on September 8th, when the United States and Soviet Union decided to accept Japan's surrender on the Korean Peninsula based on the 38th parallel, following the unconditional surrender of Japan in the World War II. After 3 years of military administration in the southern half of Korea, the U.S. military forces handed its control over the South Korean government when the Republic of Korea was established on August 15, 1948, and completely withdrew from Korea on June 1949, only leaving a small number of advisors. When North Korea invaded South Korea on June 25, 1950, the UN Security Council adopted a resolution that functions as a legal basis for sending troops to military support to South Korea by the UN member state. Based on these resolutions, for example, Resolution 83 and 84, the first military troops stationed in Japan were dispatched to South Korea on July 1st. The forces of United Nations Command sent based on the UN Security Council resolutions were composed of the 6 member state military units, but an overwhelming majority of them were United States military troops. Despite South Korea's opposition, the United States concluded the armistice agreement with North Korea and China on July 27, 1953. At the time, the South Korea agreed the U.S. signing on the armistice agreement under the promise that the U.S. would be responsible to a certain degree for the defense of South Korea by making a treaty for this, but South Korea itself did not sign on the armistice agreement. Later, South Korea and the United States concluded the Mutual Defense Treaty between Republic of Korea and the United States of America, which took effect on November 18, 1954. Article 4 of the Mutual Defense Treaty provides a legal basis for the United States military forces to station in South Korea. It reads as follows: the Republic of Korea grants and the United States of America accept the rights to dispose United States lands and air and sea forces in and about the territory of the Republic of Korea as determined by the mutual agreement. This is one-sided provision that only prescribes the rights of the United States that enable it to place U.S. military forces in the territory of Korea and its vicinity without any corresponding rights of South Korea, which often raise a question of inequality of the treaty. And Article 4 states that the U.S. can dispose its forces by mutual agreement. Thus, in pursuant to the provision, 2 countries concluded the agreement on July 9, 1966, under Article 4 of the Mutual Defense Treaty between the Republic of Korea and the United States of America regarding facilities and areas and the status of the United States arms in the Republic of Korea, which mainly concern the status of U.S. military forces. Before this agreement, a criminal jurisdiction of the U.S. Army troops in Korea had been regulated by agreements relating jurisdiction over criminal offenses committed by the United States forces in Korea between the Republic of Korea and the United States of America, which concluded on July 12, 1950 during the war.